So over this course of this lecture, we'll essentially be going through a few things. We'll spend the first half of the lecture talking about different Excel functions. We'll be looking at functions like vertical lookup, if, for example, and how to essentially get information from the data that we have that we might want. And in the second half of the lecture, we're going to do something that's very interesting and a lot of fun. We're going to take an actual trading strategy in Excel, and we'll go through an example of how to analyze it. So we're going to look at a particular strategy. We'll be looking at a moving crossover strategy, moving average crossover, and we'll be testing it out and seeing how it performs in Excel. And this is, of course, so that we learn how to do this and get comfortable with using the program. Alright then, let's get started. Arithmetic. Arithmetic, of course, is essentially very simple mathematics: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Also slightly more complex, but still not very complicated. Parentheses, exponents, and logarithms. And looking at minimum and maximum of data. So of course I'm not going to be explaining to you what these things are. What I will be doing is showing you how to do these in Excel. And it is very straightforward. The most important thing here is to follow along and just make sure that whatever we're doing you know how to do yourself. It's a good idea to try and practice this on your own in Excel, maybe after the lecture or even during if you would like. Welcome back to Excel. Now here we have data for the Nifty index. This is from the start of 2005 until the end of 2011. All we have is the date and the closing prices for the index. Now if you remember, this was the same data that we used in the last lecture in our first part of the Excel tutorial. And in this lecture we will also be using the same data set. We'll primarily be using it later on when we want to test out a trading strategy example. But for now I wanted to just go through the things I mentioned on the previous slide, how to do them in Excel. So the first thing I would like to bring your attention to is the Excel Help button. So if you go up here to the top right hand corner, you see this question mark. Click that and you'll end up with this Excel Help box. Now in here you can look for any function, for example, that you want. So let's say I want to look up a function log, okay, which is a logarithm. So in here there will be all kinds of different questions. For example, log graph. And if I want to see the function, I can click on this. This goes to a link, so this goes to a website which tells you about it. You can also go to a function reference, which essentially details all the different functions in Excel. So for example, you want to see compatibility functions. Okay, you go into here and it will give you all these functions and a description of what they do. Now if you want to actually find out how it works, you can just click on that function. So this is the standard deviation function, just an example, and you go in here and it will tell you exactly how to use it, and it will show you an example as well. So the Excel Help button is very, very useful. If you're ever getting stuck on how to do something in Excel, I would recommend using it. And whatever functions we learn over this lecture, you can also go through the help to learn more. And even some of the articles contain tutorials on how to use it step by step if you're still having difficulty afterwards. Alright, so now let's go through addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. I'll spend as little time possible on this. So addition, for example, I want to add these two numbers. I take the cell, plus button, and the next number, for example. I want to subtract them. I take that minus that. Easy enough. I want to multiply them. Take that, put a multiplication sign, there you go, and divide them, division sign, which is /, there you go. Okay, now we also have parentheses, exponents, and logarithms. So parentheses, if I have a longer equation, so let's say I want to do in parentheses, I open brackets here, this number plus, let's say this number, close the brackets, times the number above it. And there you have using parentheses. With exponents, you would do a particular number and then to the power of, which is the looks like that, should be on top of the 6 on your keyboard, to the power of, let's say 2, that will square the value. Okay? Then we also have logarithms. So for example, if I want to do a logarithm, I would just do log. Okay, now you essentially have log 10, which gives you the logarithm with base 10 of a particular number. So I can take the logarithm of that number. You also have ln, which is the natural logarithm, which is log with base e. So I can do that. And then you also have the log function, which essentially you can put the number in and then put the base that you want. So if I want to get a logarithm of this with, say, base 5, I can do that. Okay, so fairly straightforward how these functions work. The last two I would like to show you are minimum and maximum. This is also very useful. So let's say I want to find the minimum value of a particular series of data. Okay, I would do min, and then I would select the numbers that I want. So for example, let's say I want to find the minimum value of the Nifty in December 2011. I just select all the values that I need, which is here from the 1st of December to the 30th, and that gives me the minimum value of the index over that month. And likewise, I can do the same with the maximum. So maximum, the function is just max, and then I select the data that I want to find the maximum of. Okay, all is fairly straightforward, so let's carry on now to the next section. Copy, paste, and sort. We'll now go through some other simple functions in Excel. So we'll learn how to copy and paste, and some of you may be thinking, why are we learning how to copy and paste? Well, in Excel it's slightly more complicated than it is, for example, in Word when you're copying text, because we now have to think about copying formulas. So we'll go to copy and paste, and we also have this $sign when we're doing copy and pasting, which changes the way it copies or pastes. So we'll explain how that works. We'll talk about paste special, and finally we'll talk about how to sort. So how to sort data if we want to order it in a particular way, or we want to sort it by a particular column, etc. Let's now go back to Excel and go through these 4 items. Okay, so now we're back in Excel, back to our same data set. The first thing we will look at is how to copy across a formula. Now before we do that, obviously we need to create a formula. So now what I'm going to do is create a formula here that is essentially going to be equal to this value minus the previous day's value. Okay? B2 minus B3. This is essentially the change in the value of the index over that one day. Now I can copy this formula down. Okay, so I do Control C, and let's say I want to copy it down to the next row. I do Control V. Okay. Now what's important to notice here is that here I had B2 minus B3, and when I copied it down to the next row, it became B3 minus B4. So it automatically shifted each of the rows in the formula down by 1 because I was moving it down 1. Okay, and this is generally very useful for us because we want to calculate it going down. So if I do it on the next one, then it will be B4, which is here, minus B5. Right, so it's going to copy down the rows. Now if I copy it across, okay, it's now going to move across the column from B to C and keep the rows. So this will be C2 minus C3. Alright, so this is essentially how to copy across a formula. But now what happens if I want to make sure that the rows or columns don't change when I copy the formula? Okay? So let's say, for example, I want to copy this formula C2 minus C3. Okay, and I want to move it, I want to have it in this column as well. If I put it here, it becomes H2 minus H3, which obviously is nothing in this case. But let's say I want to actually copy C2 minus C3 into here without the column changing from C to H. Okay, let's say, for example, if I want to copy it here, then I want neither the row nor the column to change. Right, so how do I do this? So this is where we have what is called the $sign to tell us not to change the row or the column when copying. So now if I change this formula, alright, let's say I have C2 minus C3 and I want to keep the rows always constant whenever I copy, then all I need to do is put a $sign in front of the rows. Right, it's going to be the same answer here. The difference is when I copy it across, so I do copy and let's say I put it down here, again the row does not change. Right, it's still C2 minus C3 here and C2 minus C3 here. Whereas here when we copy the row down, it changed from 2 to 3 here and 4 to 5 here. So that $sign prevents the row from being copied. That's if you put it in front of the row. Now of course that doesn't guarantee the column won't be copied, right? So I put it here. The C that is here becomes a D over here. Okay? So now if I don't want the column to be copied as well, I just put a $sign in front of the C. Alright? Now wherever I put this, let's say I put it all the way over here, right, it's still C2 minus C3. So that's how we use the $sign whenever we want to copy a formula without the corresponding rows or columns to change. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is paste special. And this is mostly important when we want to paste formulas into values. Okay. So now I have these 3 formulas over here. But let's say I don't want them to be formulas, I want them to be the actual numbers themselves. So all I need to do is copy, Control C. Then after that, I click Alt key on my keyboard, Alt, E, S, and this gives you paste special. You can also find it in the toolbar. And if I do paste special values, then it will just copy across the values. Okay, and you can see now instead of the formula being there, it's been replaced by the values. So this is very important. We'll be using this a lot, copying formulas to values. And you can also paste special and copy into value formulas themselves. So this is very useful to know. The final thing I want to go through is the sort function. Okay. So the sort function, essentially what it allows us to do is order data in the way that we want to. So here, for example, I have the nifty index, which is ordered by date, right, in descending order. So let's say, for example, I want to change this. Okay, select all the data. Now I can go to data up here, sort, and here I can sort by either the date or nifty. So let's say this time I want to sort by the index value, and I want to sort by the smallest value to the largest value. Okay, and this can be largest to smallest or some other custom way. So now it's going to show me the values in ascending order for the nifty, and the date obviously becomes something else. I can go back and then sort it, let's say, by date, and oldest to newest will give me from the start date to the end date. right? And I can go back then to what we had initially, which was newest to oldest. And that's what we started with. So that's how we use the sort function. Fairly straightforward. Let's carry on. The if function. The if function is a very important function in Excel, one that we will use quite frequently. Essentially, what it does, it checks to see whether a specified condition that you put in is true or false. If that condition is true, one thing happens, and if it is false, then something else happens. The best way to illustrate how this works is through an example. So we can, for example, specify that our condition is the market went up today. Then every time that condition is true, so every time the market went up, the function will return the value 1. Every time it is false, so every time the market did not go up, i.e. it went down, then it will return the value -1. And we can specify the values that we wanted to return. This is just an example. So let's go back into Excel and see exactly how this works. The first thing I would like to do before we do this if function is calculate the change in the index on each day. Okay, so the change in the index, and I'm just going to look at the absolute change here, is the day's closing price minus the previous day's closing price. And I'll copy this formula all the way down. Alright, the last value obviously is not necessary because there's no value below that. Now what we have here, essentially the parenthesis sign means it's a negative value, it means it went down. So in this case, the market fell by 21.95 from the 29th to the 30th, and that's the change in the index. So now I want to specify an if function that does what in the example we discussed in the PowerPoint slide. So if the market went up, we'll return the value 1. If the market went down, we'll return the value -1. How do we do this? So here I will say if is my function. Alright, now we have a logical test, that is our specification, the value if the test is true, if the condition is met, and the value if it is false. So now I want to say if the market went up, return the value 1. If the market went down, return the value -1. So the market went up means that this change value is greater than 0, right? So if C2 is greater than 0, then the value if it's true, 1. Value if it's not true, -1. Right? And here, for example, we can see it's given us a -1, right? Because what it's saying here is if C2 is greater than 0, give us 1. If C2 is not greater than 0, give us -1. In this case, C2 is not greater than 0, it's less than 0. So we have -1. And now I can copy this formula all the way down, and then what we can see is that every time there's a 1, it means the market went up on that day. Every time there's a -1, it means the market went down on that day. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward, and it's very, very useful because we can now do a lot of things with this. We can, for example, look at this and say, well, how many days did the market go up? How many days did it go down? What days did we make money? What days did we not? Now, I want to show you something else with an if, which is interesting as well. So let's do that right now. The next thing we will discuss with the if function is what is known as nested functions. What we do here, we can use multiple if conditions in the same formula. So here what we did was, we did if the change in the market was greater than 0, give us a 1, otherwise give us a -1. So now what I will do is attach two conditions to our value. So what I can do is this: if C2 is greater than 10, so let's say the market went up by more than 10, then give me 2. If C2 is greater than 0, then give me 1, and otherwise give me -1. So now what it will do is that it will give me -1 whenever the market fell. It will give me 2 if the market went up by more than 10, and it will give me 1 if the market went up between 0 and 10. Alright, so now every time the market went up by more than 10, we have a 2. Every time the market went up between 0 and 10, like here, we have a 1. And we can actually add as many if conditions as we want in this formula bar. Right, so there's quite a lot we can do with this. Let's now move on to the next topic. VLOOKUP function. Another Excel function that is very commonly used is known as VLOOKUP, which stands for vertical lookup. So here is what it does. VLOOKUP, it looks at a value in one column and finds its corresponding value in another column on the same row. We'll go through an example to see how it works. So it is like looking up a telephone number in a phone book. Right? So I may look up a person's name and I want the phone number that corresponds to that name. Now, for example, we may want to find out the change in the value of the Nifty index on the 1st of every month or any particular date. Right? And this is very useful for when we have a very large data set and it's cumbersome for us to go through the values ourselves. We just make a formula that pulls it out for us. So let's go back to Excel and see how this works. Back to our same data set. Now what we are going to do is create a VLOOKUP function that tells us the value of the index on a particular date. So what we want to do is look up the date, right, and then return the Nifty value. So now, for example, let's say I put the date, okay, in this column. I'm going to put the date in this cell here, and I'm going to put the index value over here. So what I want to do is VLOOKUP. So I want to look up the value, the date, which will be over here. I haven't put anything in yet, but I will. The table array is essentially the table that you're looking at. So that's going to be all that. The column index number, I want to look up the second column. So I want to look up the Nifty value. It's going to look up whatever's in the first column and return to me the second column. And range lookup can be true or false. If you say true, it gives you the approximate value. If it's false, it's an exact match. So because I'm looking at dates which are exact values, I can do an exact match false. Now you can look in the Excel help function, play around with it a bit more if you want to understand the difference between those two. It's not particularly important. Right? So right now there's nothing there because I haven't obviously put anything here. So now let's say I want the value of the index on 12/9/2011, right, which is this value here. It now returns me this index value here. So you can see it's really convenient because I can find the value of the index on any day I want. And now I can change this to something like, let's say, 2006. Now there's no value for that. Possibly that day was a holiday. So let's just try the very next day. That's also not there. So those two must have been holidays. And now we have this, for example, day, and it's returned me this index value. Right? So now I can do this for a single value. I can do this for the whole month. So let's say, for example, I want the value. I can copy across this formula. And I can, so if I put $signs so that these don't change, I can, let's say, copy across this formula to here. Right, now it's going to look up G2. And let's say here, for example, I put 12/30/2011. And here I put 12/30/2010. So this is giving me the values at the end of each of the last 2 years. And I can create whatever dates I want and then just copy across the formula. Alright, so for example, we could use it to find the value of the index at the end of each month, at the end of each year, however we want to order it. We just need to select the dates that we want the value and then create it that way. So we can then create a whole table. We can convert this daily values into something that has just the monthly values or just the yearly values, however we want to do it. And this is what the VLOOKUP function is useful for. Pivot tables. The next concept we will discuss are what is known as pivot tables. A pivot table is essentially used to aggregate and summarize a large data set. So how can we use this practically? Let's say, for example, in our Nifty index, we wanted to find out how many days did the market go up and how many days did the market fall. Now we could be stupid and count every single day that it fell or rose, and we've got a few thousand data points, so that will take us a long time. Or we can use a pivot table, which will give us the answer right away. And we can do other interesting things like look at, for example, how much did the market change on average on down days when it fell, or how much did it change on average on up days, i.e. when it rose? Is there a difference between the two? And these are interesting questions for which the answers are certainly useful. So let's go back to Excel and see how this works. The next thing we will do is create a pivot table to show us the number of days the market went up versus the number of days it went down, as well as to look at the average change on the day it went up and the average change on the way it went down. In order to create this, we'll first have to create the change and the function for when it goes up and down, and this will be using functions that we've already done. So I'm going to put change in over here, and this will be just the closing price minus the previous day's closing price. And then I'm going to call this UD, which stands for up or down. And we'll use the if function here, like we did before. So we'll say if this is greater than 0, then give me a 1, otherwise give me a -1. So again, here we have -1 if the market fell, and 1 if the market rose. So before we carry on, I'm just going to copy and paste these as values, not as formulas. When we do a table, it's generally a good idea to use values rather than formulas. And now we'll create the pivot table. So I'm going to use these two columns to create the pivot table. So I select all the data, then I go to Insert, Pivot Table. Okay, and this is the data selected, and it's going to move to a new worksheet, which is fine. I press OK, and now it's here. So now we have two fields. We have the change and we have up or down. So now let's say I want to find out how many days did the market go up or down. I would need to, so up or down is like I will put that in the row labels. Okay, so how many times we see a -1 versus how many times we see a 1. And the change will go here into the values. Right, so this is looking at the sum of the total change on down days. That's the sum of the change on up days. That's not particularly interesting for us, but what we can do is change this to count. And here is something interesting, right? So what we see here is that we're essentially counting the number of times it appears as -1 and the number of times change appears gives you a +1. So this is saying that on 828 days the market went down, there was a -1, and on 896 days the market went up. So the market went up on more days than it went down. Now we can change count to something like average. Now this tells us the average change when the market went up was 52.30 points, and the average change when the market went down was 51.30 0.01 points. So they're fairly close, but what we can see is on average, on an up day, you can expect slightly more movement. And we can make this into various different things. So we can, for example, take the min, max, standard deviation. So standard deviation can be kind of interesting. If we look at that, what we can see here is that when the market went up, the standard deviation was 86, and when it went down, the standard deviation was 55. So what this means was that when the market went up, it was more volatile, right? There was a higher variance, higher standard deviation than when the market went down. And we can also do other interesting things like, say, min or max, standard deviation, as we said, variance, etc. So the point is that we can do different statistics on what happened when the market went up or down. And a pivot table is very useful in doing that. So now this concludes the Excel functions part of the lecture. We'll now move on to the trading strategy example.